Welcome to Assembly Calendar. I'm Mike Friesen. With us for our program today, Assemblyman Tom McKevitt. Tom McKevitt representing the 17th Assembly District, which is an assembly district that includes parts of Nassau County. We thank you folks on Long Island for joining us. Tom McKevitt, nice to see you as we are ready to head into the home stretch.
That's right.
We've rounded the final post, and we are heading towards the finish line for the 2017 legislative sessions. That's, I think, basically what we'll be talking about today. We have spent a fair amount of time talking about, in recent weeks, the state budget, the process of getting into it, the conclusion, the effects, the impact of that state budget, and now it's time to look and see what kind of business is left to do. One thing we should note is that one of the big items in that budget negotiations was the ride sharing for Long Island and upstate New York. That was included in part of the budget deal. It's being rushed, you might say, into enactment and getting it underway and in place.
Well, yeah, and when you say the whole point about the budget process here, when you look at the issues we're going to be looking at towards the end of the year, they're really not that many resolved because so many of them was done in the budget, good, bad, and different. You know, whether it was raise the age, whether it was other types of criminal justice reforms. But again, when you look at situations regarding Uber and Lyft and ride-sharing services, that was also put in the budget as well too, and what's something we call the big ugly, where a lot of legislation is put into one big package at that point. But when the bill was originally enacted, when they did the ride-sharing legislation, they go by the budget and they put a certain amount of days out in order to do it, and it winds up that legislation would have taken effect on July 9th, which is just a few days after July 4th weekend. So the thinking was, why couldn't we go and just expedite that by a few days and therefore allow it to happen before the July 4th weekend? So we actually passed a bill to bring it forth about 10 days earlier to before that weekend, and actually just yesterday the governor signed that into law.
Well, that could be a great thing then. I wonder if the ride-sharing services can be in place by then, you think?
Well, part of the issue too is, we put into the New York State Department of Motor Vehicles the whole point about licensing and regulating what they can do and what they can't do. So we didn't give them very much time in order to go and get this all together, but now they need to in just a couple of weeks at this point.
Well, I'll tell you, I'm one of the people who just had his first experience with Uber recently,
okay.
And it was easy,
right.
and it was fantastic, and it's going to be a great option for people to be able to have those alternatives in place.
Right. It certainly is a different landscape as far as commuting and as far as getting around town at this point. And again, this is something for over a number of years. New York City's had it for a number of years. Now it looks like the rest of the state will be finally looking at it as well.
Yeah,
so.
It's going to be interesting to watch, see how the rollout goes, find out the places where it works, and probably going to be some places where it doesn't work, but time will tell.
Yeah, again, it's going to be totally based upon supply and demand too. Obviously those areas are more densely populated, there'll be more competition. Certainly, in some places there won't be as much competition. So, but that's how the dynamic works sometimes.
It was interesting too to talk to the drivers, and they were relatively new at it. The ones that I ran into, and they were loving it because it just gave them that extra opportunity for a little supplemental income and all that. So there's a lot of layers to this, and it's not just the consumer end of it, where you're going to get your ride or you're not going to get your ride, but it provides an opportunity for people who are looking for just that kind of thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yes.
Now you made an interesting point in that rolled into that budget that was dealt with here in Albany a few weeks ago were a lot of big issues. The free college tuition proposal from the governor, the ride sharing, raise the age, all these different things. Does that mean that what we're looking forward to in these final weeks of the legislative session ain't much? There isn't much to do, or how's that play out?
The only issues which I say are going to be necessities that really must be done in the next couple of weeks. Obviously, mayoral control of the New York City schools. Something which got in place a long time ago by Mayor Bloomberg in that instance. Mayor de Blasio has continued it, and what's been happening as of recently is that there's only been essentially one-year extenders. So, as a matter of fact, this even became a big issue during the budget. One of the things which held up the budget at the end of the day is there was a move on the Assembly part to put mayoral control in there as well too. So just when you thought you had the budget done, more of these issues, which were traditionally end of session issues, started getting put in at the very end, and one was mayoral control. So that is one that I think one way or another is going to be resolved. The question is, how much longer period of time is going to be. The Assembly actually recently did pass a bill which allowed for mayoral control, And they did it in a very interesting technique, which is people have to realize that when you're talking about the sales tax, whether it's Nassau or Suffolk County or almost all the counties in the state of New York, they're not allowed to go and do that on their own. They essentially need permission from the state legislature to continue that, and a great number of them expire. So what the Assembly majority did was they put a bill which says we're going to go and extend all your sales taxes, but you must also go and have mayoral control along with it as well. So the Assembly passed it. My understanding, the Senate's not passing that. So those are two issues which have either been linked or not linked, and one way or another, those are ones which really have to be, for practical and financial reasons, resolved in the next few weeks.
It's a common gambit here at the state capitol. Well, you want this? Well, all right, we'll give you this if you take this too.
The best example of that we had a couple of years ago was tying between the rent control and the tax cap. And people realized that was the case, that when the tax cap was expiring, as did rent control, and that was coupled together. So again, it may very well that mayoral control gets once again coupled with the taxes as well too. Again, time will tell, but traditionally that's what happens. Again, we create a bill what's called the Big Ugly, and the reason why it's called the Big Ugly is because there's something that everyone likes and there's some people that no one likes, but you just have to go along with it for the sake of the legislation.
What kind of things would you like to see happen in these remaining few weeks?
One thing I think we still have to do is, we still have to have substantial rules reform and ethics reform. A long time called for term limits on legislative leaders. I think that would solve a lot of the issues we've had in Albany. Again, the Assembly majority, we actually brought it to the floor through a rules technique, got voted down. I think that would be very helpful, be transparent on every side. Again, allow each party go and have a bill come to the floor. I think is helpful as well too. And one thing that our minority leader Brian Kolb has been pushing for quite some time is something called Brittany's Law. We go and we have registries whereby if you're a registered sex offender, you get put on the list, so people in the community would be wary if that were the case too. There's even proposals to put a registry for people who abuse animals in that instance. This would be a person, if you've been a violent felon offender, and you will go get out of jail, you'd be on registry as well. And this was dealing with a woman and her young child who lived near a person who had been a violent offender and trusted him, maybe didn't realize the person shouldn't be trusted, and wound up getting killed and had no idea about this person's criminal history. So certainly if we have it regarding sex offenses, why not have it regarding other violent offenses as well too, whether it's an assault, whether it's a murder, that you want to know that you're living next to a murderer next door on the registry. The Senate has passed it many, many years in a row, and we can't even get it to a vote in the Assembly, and we can't even get an answer as to why it doesn't come to a vote in the Assembly. But this is, I think, a very common sense criminal justice reform which should be brought up.
There's so little discussion anymore about that sex offender registry that I sometimes think people forget about it. And It's such a resource, and it's out there. You can find it easily online by Googling it. And if you do that, I tell people you should. You should find out who's living in your neighborhood that maybe you'd be surprised to find out. And it's one of those forewarned, forearmed situations. You should try it. Just check it out because it just hasn't gotten a lot of attention in recent years, and I kind of think sometimes it's faded into the background a little bit.
I think you're right, Mike. Is Megan's Law was a very well-known law as it came out, and there are actually groups called Parents for Megan's Law which do it. But you're right. I mean, when I first came to office and there was a person moving into the neighborhood, you'd hear controversies about this all the time. And now not so much. There was recently once in my district a person moved in recently, and people are saying this person moved in the neighborhood. What are you doing about him moving in here? And I said, listen, what we can do is let people know that that's where he lives. So that's what we're able to do and give some notification. There used to be laws that local governments could do, keeping them away from schools and parks and things like that. And New York State's highest court struck that down. But I think, the best thing we can have in a public is an educated public. And again, that's so people be warned this person lives here and act accordingly.
I think sometimes that idea of time passage, taking things out of memory, I think most everybody's dealt with that at one level, one time or another.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is something that you mentioned just a couple of minutes ago, ethics reform.
Yes.
It's only been a couple of years that we saw the Speaker of the Assembly and the Leader of the Senate convicted on corruption charges.
Only 2 years.
And there was this big uproar. What's the legislature going to do to change things and change the culture and not allow something like that to happen again? Really hasn't been all that much happen yet.
Right.
And as we get farther away from those two convictions, the governor's got some aides that are going to be facing charges, and that'll sort of keep it alive, but there really hasn't been all that much done.
Well, and I think that's another piece we'd like to see accomplished in the next 2 weeks is procurement reform. And I think a lot of the issues which did happen with the governor's aides was regarding, whether it be regarding the Buffalo Billion or contracts along technology along those lines. But, one thing that was done, some reforms a couple years ago, is the comptroller has been taking out a lot of these processes. And I think the comptroller's office should be right back there. The reason why we have a comptroller is to be that physical watchdog, to see what's happening during these processes. So one thing that we would like to see is the comptroller be more actively involved whenever the spending and approving of contracts to make sure that everything is being done above board.
And it would be good to do it now. I suppose some people are going to say, well, yeah, sure, it's easy for Albany to be reactive. But based on some of our recent discussion just a couple minutes ago, yeah, you really want to be reactive, because sometimes when that spotlight is shining the brightest is when you are able to get some of those types of reforms done.
Right. And unfortunately, again, the situation which arises the concern, we thought you didn't think there was a problem until the problem simply occurred. And this is a way, I think, of hopefully solving this problem and preventing future instances from occurring.
I think one of the things that surprises people about the bidding process and all that is public bidding. The idea of a bidding process is supposed to take all of the potential corruption out of the equation, right? It's a public process. You put out there what you want to have done on the project, and then companies bid, and there's a review, and then the contract is awarded. How's that not working out?
It doesn't work out when the bid is designed for only one company to receive it.
Oh.
And that's the concern. They can go and design the parameters. The company must have this qualifications, and surprise, surprise, only one company can possibly go and can probably avail themselves under that. So I think when you talk about procurement reform, not only talk about the bidding process, but I think you have to talk about the bidding design to make sure that's transparent. Because when you go and look at the specifications, and it seems very odd, maybe it was designed such a way to go and help someone. So it may seem to be transparent, but it really wasn't.
One of those situations where you create the rules to fix things, but somebody's always going to figure out a workaround, right? An end around. So what else in these final few weeks of session that might be happening?
One thing that was promised by the governor 6 years ago, and we're still waiting for mandate relief. He composed a mandate relief commission, which my colleague Mark Molinaro from Dutchess County, namely, we've been hearing a lot about these days, involved with. And I think it met once back then, hasn't met ever since. So again, I think our local governments, our school districts, they can all use this type of relief whatsoever. And we've had bills out there by saying if you're going to go and have more than $10,000 or even $1 million, pick a number, by saying if the state is imposing this cost on local governments, let the state pick up the expense and not just push it on for someone else. I'd like to see more Medicaid relief by localities at this point.
Well, that's the mother of all mandates, right? From
absolutely.
The state, that the counties have to pay their share of I believe New York is the only state in the nation that requires the counties to pick up part of its Medicaid costs.
But no state requires counties to pick up such a large share that New York State does, by far. And when you look at a lot of upstate counties, many times that's almost their entire budget and their entire tax base is just providing for Medicaid.
Mandate relief is a program that we probably could do an hour or two on, talking about all the different impacts. There are so many things that New York State says, you have to do this. It's kind of like the various rules and regulations on businesses in the state. You have to do this, says the state of New York, and if you don't, there's fines, there's penalties, and all sorts of things. So maybe this mandate, I mean, you guys are keeping it out there, right?
Yes, we are.
Keeping the candles burning on that one.
Exactly right.
All right. Well, if you folks watching at home want to know how you can reach your representative, easy thing for you to do to get a hold of Tom McKevitt. You can contact him at the East Meadow office, dial 516-228-4960, or send an email to mckevitt@nyassembly.gov. That's McKevitt at nyassembly.gov. And Tom McKevitt, we want to thank you for letting us know what's going on here at the state capitol. It's going to be a busy couple of weeks. We hope we'll see you again for one last update as to how things play out. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you folks, too, for spending your time. We'll hope to see you soon for our next edition of Assembly Calendar.